Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the JK Friday seminar. Today I'm very excited. I'm filling in for Grant Valentine. He's away, he's traveling. And so I have a pleasure to introduce Marlies today. Marlies is actually alumnus number 8 at the JK under Adnan Lynch. And he has a 40 years experience in the mining industry, working with the Rio Tinto Group, the Zinc Rio Tinto mine Bougainville as well, that's going to talk today. He has worked in Australia and PNG for a long time in various positions and roles. He has a long, extensive operation experience in metalliferous operations and also open cut underground coal mines in Queensland. And then he has conducted a quite extensive research and development study for the CRC greenhouse gas technologies that led to the development of a geosequestration project. I think it was in New South Wales. Victoria. Interestingly, that was my background, so we had a chat this week with that as well. But today he's going to talk about the Bougainville plant, the crushing plant. He's going to talk a little bit about the crusher maintenance and performance. And I think maybe they had a world record for crusher utilization of 93 or 95% utilization, which is quite impressive. To me, Bougainville was actually two things. The first one is the French explorer who discovered the island a long time ago. And the second one was the Bougainville curves, which is the Great Deportment curves. So I'm very happy to hear about this other side of the project and the background that Mal is going to bring us today. It's going to be very interesting because I think it's really still operational issues that we see today. So without saying no more, Mal, just take it away whenever you're ready. Thanks.
Okay, well, the first thing we need to do is wind the clock back about 40 years. Right? So I'm giving the Friday seminar 40 years ago in the first JKMRC building. And it's now, I notice that room was a small room. It's now part of what is the entry foyer. And there would have been about 6 or 8 of us sitting around the table in that room. And they would have included people like myself, Alvin Lynch, Bill Whiten, probably Bill Johnson, Don McKee, and Julius Kreutzmann, who lived just down the road and sometimes came up to the seminar. And I would have been hanging on to a heap of overhead projection slides because there was no internet, there were no personal computers. You know, this was way before a lot of the stuff we know today. And we would have been sitting around drinking coffee and discussing my project and anything else, and then Julius would have been talking about his days in New Mexico and Arizona. So that's the background. Now, what we're talking about here came shortly after that. I left here, I went to work in Papua New Guinea. And Papua New Guinea, at the same time we were talking there in that room, CRA in Australia were developing one of the world's largest copper mines in a very remote location on the island of Bougainville in Papua New Guinea. And what I want to do with your agreement, I guess, is go through a bit of the history of that, because the background to that, to a large extent, drove what we did in the operations. This is just my sort of tag at the things I want to cover. But first of all, the background, a quick look at what was actually built there, so you've got a feel for it. What were industry norms? What were the economics? What were the drivers of this whole thing? What were the industry norms at the time? What we had to do to improve performance, how we tried to figure out what we need to do. and what the drivers for all that were at the time. Now, the key to the background is this project, huge project, very large crushing milling flotation plant. At that stage, the world's largest copper concentrator. It was the largest that had ever been built. It was running 90,000 tonnes a day. And we were producing, I remember, and these figures are from memory, in 1978, I think about 200,000 tonnes of copper and 24 metric tonnes of gold contained in concentrate. So this was an operation of serious size. It had the largest mills, ball mills that were built at that stage, very large three-stage crushing plant. Where is it? I don't think, can you see them? You can see the mouse pointer there. 3-hour jet flight to Moresby. Jet aircraft were kind of novel at this stage. The international terminal at Brisbane was at the end of a wartime igloo, had 30 seats. And the new jets had more than 30 seats, so the overflow wandered up and down the curb on the footpath outside before you boarded. And security was next to zero. Then from Moresby across to the island was another 3-hour flight in a fast propeller aircraft, turboprop aircraft, like a Fokker Friendship. So it was an all-day exercise to get to site. Just going a little bit closer, that just gives you a better idea of what the terrain around there is. You're on the Pacific Plate here. This is earthquake country, volcanoes and the like. Solomon Islands, very close, but Papua New Guinea border actually goes through here. So Bougainville is in Papua New Guinea, but it's really part of the Solomon Islands. And the people of Papua New Guinea are quite different in most areas than the people of Bougainville. They regard themselves as Solomon Islands. And that had a lot to do with problems that arose later. Coming in closer to the island itself, 2 active volcanoes here, Balbi and Bagana. You can see a dormant caldera here. Down the other end of the island, another dormant volcano, Tabuari. And that was the one that always worried us because it was near our towns in Arawa. And there was another town up here near the mine. You can see the mine there, that little scar. And there are some tailings deposits in the river valley. No way could you build tailings dams for the earthquakes and volcanic activity. Just not a proposition. Coming in closer, you can still see the, if you go and Google it, it's there, in the town here. I just run a little movie taken from my front veranda initially to give you an idea of the terrain around this place. Building a project, you're thousands of miles from anywhere in tropical jungle conditions, very difficult to do anything, but the project was built and developed. It was a magnificent achievement from a technical point of view. That's the town of Arawa. You can see the geology, and just up the road, in fact, the view on the way to work was something like that in the mornings. 2 active volcanoes. Terrain was very severe. Rainfall very high. Pipeline to all of the resources you need to run an operation was extensive. So things had to be very self-sufficient. And as you'll see a little bit later in this, the mine is not the only thing that produces tailings. Volcanoes are very good at it as well. They're called lava flows. That's the caldera that you saw on the shot before. I mean, it is a magnificent sight, but incredibly rugged. while this is showing, the people of Bougainville are still recovering from the Japanese occupation of World War II. It was a major source of conflict. And in 1990, the Bougainville secession movement actually resulted in a civil war that closed the mine. And today, 20 odd years on, they're still recovering from that second round of military activity. So you're talking about an area that is really, in terms of the Pacific region, had more upset in that domain than any other area. This is Valby, I think. And probably looking down the side, you see the lava flows. And a bit of history as you look south. From here, you're down towards Boone and Kahili Airfield. That's famous because the Japanese commander-in-chief in World War II was shot down there by the Americans early in the war. The guy who gave the decision to bomb Pearl Harbor. And his aircraft is still in the jungle there near Kahili. And also the Australian base, that's looking towards Kahili. The Australian base was at Torokina, which will pop up in a second. That little inlet there. And I learned a lot about that because I got the job one day of taking Charles Court, the former Premier of Western Australia, around. And he was an officer in charge of troops there in World War II. I think he's now passed on. Okay, that was the interesting stuff. Now I get to the boring stuff about crushing. This is the plant, a huge plant by any standards. Make it a bit easier for you, a picture. There was a primary crusher located at the pit, coarse ore stockpile. This area here is secondary crushing, then tertiary crushing down here. Screening plant, fine ore stockpile, milling section, flotation, concentrate handling, and offices. Quite a compact scenario, but you're talking a very large plant. It's a 90, 100,000 tonne a day plant. Milling section, there were 9 18-foot mills. 18-foot mills were the largest at the stage. The 8 of them were 21 feet long. The last one had been installed at 24 feet, and subsequent ones, I think, were even longer. They put in 2 or 3 more after that. One was a regrind. Crushing plant. Up the top end there is the secondary crushing plant. That had 7 Simon Shorthead 7-foot crushers in it, and the tertiary plant had 14 Simon Shortheads. There was room for 1 more secondary and 2 more tertiary crushers. That was all. That's the crushing control room. There's Joe Mamoy and Eddie McKinnon, I think, in there. Someone must have told them they were taking photos because I don't think they dressed that well normally. We get to the why. The why is all about economics, really. This was a huge upfront capital investment. You can imagine a remote area, massive capital cost. You have to do everything. You have to run the power stations, you have to build the towns, you have to run the electricity system, the garbage service, train the people. There are very few trained operators in Papua New Guinea. You had to bring in overseas expertise, you had to get equipment from overseas. Massive upfront capital expenditure. High fixed costs. If you produced or didn't produce, the costs were still rolling through the door. But relatively low variable costs compared to all of that. Proximity to market wasn't bad because we were kind of halfway to the Japanese smelters. We're near the equator, so in terms of shipping, not a bad thing. Very good product quality that the smelters loved it. In other words, we weren't market constrained. We could sell everything we could produce. If we could produce more, we could sell more. Simple as that. Price, of course, determined by the London Metal Exchange. And clearly, it's like all projects. What's the revenue equation? It's to do with throughput and recovery. But principally from throughput, because of utilisation. If you've got no utilisation, you don't need to ask about recovery, there is none. And your recovery comes primarily from the kilowatt hours a tonne, in other words, the fineness of grind or crushing or whatever. So you've got this independent equation, but the key is to get the ore through the plant. Then you can decide about how well you deal with the recovery. And so the solution was pretty simple: maximise the kilowatt hours in the main operating plant, and then decide how much you're going to devote to the recovery. And that became a significant issue. First thing was to change the mindset on utilisation, because in those days, the accepted performance for a crushing plant was about 75% utilisation. That was considered good practice. The milling plant, 85 was considered good practice. That was what we were told, 75 is good stuff. What we actually achieved, I know that when I was in the crushing plant, we got to 92 in the crushing plant. And we're talking a 365 or 366 day year, not some other working week or whatever. And the milling plant, when I was there, we got to 98.8, and I think my successor got it to 99. So these are quite exceptional figures, and there was no fudge involved, they were real. And that was driven by the need to recover investment, because that was the way you could do it: sell more and drive it along. Now, why a focus on crushing? Well, crushing is different than milling. You fill a ball mill up with balls and turn it over. Even if it's got no feed in it, it still draws a lot of power. It's just smashing up balls and liners. If you put feed in, it varies somewhat, but essentially the power draw is largely driven by the ball load and the size of the machine. The crusher is very different. Take the feed off, the power goes to almost zero. And crushers have a different characteristic too, in that if it's bigger than the open side setting, it doesn't get out, does it? And we, in fact, because of that, when we looked at our plant, we had the equivalent of 2 ball mills in that plant. We had in the primary crusher. It's the equivalent in terms of horsepower of 2 ball mills. In other words, something like a quarter of the operating capacity was in there, and because of the nature of crushers, probably a more efficient way of delivering the power. So there's a very big incentive to get that to work. And of course, the more work you do in the crusher, the better the mill operates. You've got to find a feed, you can run at higher throughputs or take better recovery. Pretty simple equation, it's not rocket science. So okay, what happens when you try to do it? It's interesting in terms of increasing utilisation. One of the first things we encountered was what I call a competition problem. Mill versus crusher. It was a bit like a state of origin match. The mill would go flat out and empty the fine ore stockpile and then shut down and say, well, they couldn't keep up. And then the ore type would change and we'd go flat out and fill up the fine ore stockpile, and we'd shut down and say, well, they didn't take it. Stupid system, absolutely stupid system, because what you end up with is a whole lot of very expensive capital equipment sitting around doing not a lot, because you haven't got this sorted. And it occurs to me that sometimes I see what goes on in Canberra, and I think our federal parliament might actually operate on this system. We had to change that system, and we did. We had to manage ore type variations, both all the way from the mine to the mill into flotation. Joint stockpile management was essential. The aim was really to never have the stockpile full and never let it get empty. Everything had to run all of the time. Stockpile outages, taboo. In the crusher, we had to develop operational strategies that would allow us to balance our rate with the mill. And the mill had to do the same to balance their rate with us. Now, they had a convenient way to do that. They could slow down a bit and take bank some recovery. In our case, we had to come up with a way to actually increase our rate, and it actually turned out simplistic. In the screening plant, we had 22 single deck screens, and the screen sizes were selected to be a bit on the fine side to try and give the mill the best outcome. But if you started to run slower than the mill because of ore type variation, we found that if we simply changed the first cloth, which on a single deck screen is very quick and easy, first cloth on the screen to a bigger screen size, on about half a dozen of the screens, and you could vary the number, we could increase our rate and help balance that. So those sort of things became the norm. If you were starting to get behind the mill, like on some coarse screens, it's very quick, easy exercise, continuous downtime. Bring the crushing rate up a bit, keep the stockpile happy, the mill keeps running, everyone's happy. We also, and the mill of course could vary their recovery goal to assist and bank some recovery. The other thing you can play with is scheduled maintenance. If you've got a scheduled maintenance program that's well under control, you can vary the timing of that a bit. If you've got an ore type problem you know is going to go away in a day or two, you can vary schedules and get around that. So we did that. And the other thing we both did is we worked very hard to improve maintenance performance, and that was the real thing that caused the crusher to fly. And on another scene, the production planning people had come up with some stuff that was pretty useful in terms of predicting what the plant would do. One of the assets of Bougainville's ore body was that it was dipping vertically. So if you had an ore shovel on a certain bench and you logged what the plant did from that ore shovel, what you knew was that the next time the shovel came to that location one bench down, the ore was going to be the same. So if you had a record of what your plant performance was on the bench above, you could then look at the next bench down data and say, well, this is what we can expect. So we started to also get predictions about what was going to happen that had some credibility. They weren't just pie in the sky. So that also helped. Now, crushing maintenance, that was probably the big task. 75%. 75% is ridiculous. What it means is that one day in every 4, the main function of your plant is to sit there and keep the rain off the equipment or keep the sun off the ground. Crazy. And then the milling plant at 85 is one day in every 6 it's sitting there keeping the sun off the equipment. Not a good scene. That had to change. And in the crusher, the big problem was to work out, you've got all this gear, and you can imagine, you've got 22 tertiary screens and screen plant, there's 7 secondary crushers in their screen, 14 tertiaries, there's apron feeders, there's trippers, conveyors, where do you start? And some of those stages, people are starting to do computerised maintenance programs. Well, our computer department had just graduated from the PDP-8. Sorry. They got themselves a COBOL machine and they weren't having a hell of a lot of success with the payroll. So clearly that wasn't an option. But what we did persuade them to do, because we found operators' log sheets were next to useless. The operator, you get your operator's log sheet at the end of the day, a foreman would sign off. Good shift, bad shift, something or other happened. But you really didn't know. We didn't introduce a computerised maintenance system. What we did was introduced a computerised log sheet. So when anything went down, the operator just logged it, went down. Didn't matter too much why, because sometimes he wouldn't get it right. And when it came back on, he'd log it as back up. That's all we did. And suddenly we started to get information about time, frequency, those sorts of things. And in parallel with that, the maintenance guys, my maintenance engineer was John Edgar, is no longer with us, unfortunately. John said, what we need to do is list out all the maintenance jobs in this plant and get choosy about which ones we get interested in. So they did. Him and the maintenance guys sat down. They listed all the jobs. And they picked on two categories. The two categories were the really big jobs that happened infrequently, like once a year or thereabouts. But they were big jobs, and if you got them wrong, it could shut you down for days. And you couldn't afford that. The other thing they focused on were the small jobs, but because you got the data on it, these things occurred so frequently that collectively they added up to a downtime that you couldn't live with. So we categorised those to, there weren't that many of them actually. And the rest of them we said, well, to hell with the rest of them, they're not worrying us too much, we'll just handle them as they come. And the big jobs, one of the reasons for the big jobs was that we had a lot of maintenance people on 6 months contracts, so it was not unusual if you had a big job that came around every 18 months or something, to find that there was very few people on the team that were there the last time you did it. So for those big and infrequent jobs, we set up job methods. We prepared a job method, worked it through with the maintenance guys. How are you going to do it? Got all the parts organised, prepared a parts inventory, equipment inventory. Do you need cranes? Do you need this? Do you need that? Got it all set up as an interim project. And when that job come around, one of the engineers worked with the team while they did it. He noted what went right, he noted what went wrong. He changed the method to make sure next time round it didn't happen. And the same sort of thing with the smaller jobs that occurred very frequently. We developed ways of getting around it. I'll just show you a couple of examples. An example of large jobs is the head pulley change out on the coarse-ore conveyors. These are not toy conveyors. There's the primary crusher. They're 2 kilometres long. They go up the hill. They're 54-inch steel cord belts. Each have a dual drive pulling 2.2 megawatts. If you've got to change the head pulley up there, and you could see in that previous slide the counterweights, you've got to detension the belt, you've got to move it away from the head pulley, you've got to take the roof off. To do it, you have to bulldoze a pad on the stockpile and sit a crane on your stockpile. You're going to sit a crane on the stockpile, you can't use your stockpile. So while this is going on, there is no production. So once you start that process, this job has to go right. You've got to take the roof off there, detension the belt, pull it away, get the pulley out, get the new one in, get the belt retension, get the roof back on, restart it, get back in production. We eliminated virtually the problems for those sorts of jobs. In the early rounds, we'd lose days when something like this would go wrong. You couldn't afford it. To give you an example of the small jobs, one of those was secondary screen maintenance. Unlike the tertiary screens, the secondary screens for the secondary crushers were double-deck screens. One of the perennial problems was cloth failures on the lower deck of the screen. Now, if you look at, and there were big safety issues with this. If you look at, you've got an apron feeder up here, you've got a double-deck screen there, and a crusher here. If you've got to get into that, between the two cloths in that screen to replace the cloth in the middle of the night, this doesn't work. You've got a conveyor operating underneath, there's dust coming up, it's dangerous, it's never done right. You bring the screen back online, 6 hours later it fails again. So what did we do? We purchased 2 spare screens. We always had one screen fully repaired and rebuilt, and by repaired I don't mean change the cloth. They checked everything. They checked bearings, they checked seals, drive belts, frames, clamp bars, cloths, you name it. It was all done. That thing was ready to go. When it went in, it didn't come out until it was next scheduled. The other screen was under rebuild, and then we developed a fast change-out method to change those screens. We nominated 2 hours. From the time the button was pushed to stop it, till the time the button was pushed to restart it. The last I saw of it when I left the plant, they were achieving under 1.5 hours. So that huge loss of downtime, and remember this is on the main feed end to the crushing plant. Losing time here, the whole plant cops it. That just went away, disappeared. The other problem we had was our secondary crushers were loafing. They weren't really contributing as much as they could to power draw. And the reason was the design again of the system. We were getting a low kilowatt hour contribution. What we did, I'll go to the picture again, the feeder up here was too far away from the crusher to have any effective power control, because you got a lump of coarse stuff come across. By the time you turn this feeder off, it's long into the bin, the crusher power would go off scale, it would trip. So the thing would be up and down like a yo-yo, and what the operators do then is they run it at low power, don't they? Low feed rate. What we did was we cut the bottom off that chute there, above the crusher, and put a vibrating feeder in. We put a level controller in the chute, a level measurement device. We tied the level back to the apron feeder up there. We tied the vibrating feed controller to the power controller on the crusher motor. So the crusher had a quick way to respond to power peaks. It could immediately stop the vibrating feeder, drop down the amount of material going straight into the chamber, got over the peak, it'd whack the power back up again. And at the other end, the apron feeder had a long enough delay and enough surge in the bin, it would taper off its feed rate, the bin level would start to come down, and it would speed up again. That way, the power draw on those crushers jumped dramatically. I mean, they were running at, I don't know, 30 or 40% rate of power. We, towards the end, were getting much more. It was more like 80 or somewhere thereabouts. That's on your main feed in to the plant. The other thing we had to do was prepare for expansion. Now the mill was lucky because once again the revenue equation says produce more, and the mill had room. They could just keep adding mills. We couldn't. We had room for 1 more secondary crusher. We had room for 2 more tertiaries, but the design of the building really didn't allow us to do too much more than that. So we had to get it out of horsepower. We're already pushing the 350 horsepower machines to more like 400, and we were getting some failures of frames and things. Mind you, when I had a look overseas, everyone else overseas was getting the same sort of problem, so we weren't unique. So we had to come up with a way to get more horsepower into these machines, and what we did was we embarked on a program of testing higher horsepower crushers. And we did test a hydrocone at 500, we weren't happy with it. At the end of the day, we developed with Nordberg and Vickers, we developed the SXHD crusher, which was a 500 horsepower crusher. And by increasing those to 500 and by putting in the extra 3 crushers, that gave us quite a substantial bit of expansion capacity to feed additional mills. A few words on the workforce. Real United Nations. I'd never worked with anything like it. It was fascinating. And the operations crew, the leadership there was mostly ex-British military. In fact, Scottish, some of them. And 1 or 2 mercenaries thrown in of various nationalities, because you got those in those sorts of places. They'd been in quite a few wars. But they were very effective guys at running the operation. If you got Papua New Guineans organised like a football team, they worked exceptionally well. Good operators. Mechanical maintenance, different story again. Most of the leadership were German, ex or Australian German. I used to call them the Panzer Division. They worked hard and they played hard, but boy were they effective. And while everyone else had fiberglass and wooden boats, they had a steel hull vessel called the Bismarck. They were that different. Electrical maintenance, my electrical superintendent was, he was actually a Yugoslav, as a country doesn't exist now. I think today he would be a Croatian. His offsider was Scottish. Plant engineer John Edgar, he was English, but Australian English, I suppose. And the metallurgist was actually Dave Langford, and Dave made a hell of a big contribution because you were talking to me about these curves. Dave came into my office one day and he said, you know that stuff we've been doing on crushing? He said, we found something very interesting. And I said, what is it? And he said, well, you know the fines is higher grade than the feed. He said, if you just crush it, the fines get upgraded. And this was 1976 or something, I can't remember, but later on in the project they developed the waste screening plant where you took waste out of the pit, crushed it, screened it, and the fines from the screening plant actually became ore and increased the pit recovery substantially. And Papua New Guineans, we had them all. We had Highlanders, Tolais, Bougainvillians, you name it, and it all worked. It was a very, I mean, managing cultural differences was for me fun and intriguing at the start, but you got used to it. They had a whole different set of rules within their village environment to what we had, and what the employment agreements said they should have made sense. What made sense in an English context had absolutely no relevance to how they applied it in the village environment. So you had a whole new domain to deal with, but it worked. Right, well, beyond work, we didn't work all the time. I actually built a boat and went fishing. It's a magnificent fishing area around there. That was my young son, one of my sons. He's now 40, so he's growing up a bit. And I learnt to fly an aeroplane. I started my pilot's license. I learnt Morse code. I got a ham radio license, and I learnt to fly model aeroplanes, believe it or not. And if you're looking for me on Sunday mornings now, that's where you're going to find me. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. That was very interesting. So we're going to take, we have time for a few questions. Yes. Any questions?
Oh, thanks for the interesting presentation. If you were to do things differently at Bougainville, because we all know that on the mine sector and huge economic costs, both to the company as well as to the local community, if you were to do it again, what you would do differently so that to avoid the social conflict which has made this difficult?
It's a good question, and one that's not easy to answer, because if you think back 40 years ago, what was done at Bougainville in terms